All right, so for this summary, I will be summarizing chapter 11 of Hearing the New Testament Strategies for Interpretation by Joel B. Green. This chapter was on discourse analysis and New Testament interpretation. And I thought that it was really interesting how in this chapter, on the front end, Green will kind of break down, which I'll walk us through what discourse analysis is. And I think he does a really good job of explaining that. But I also like how after that he moves on to interpret Luke 3 using discourse analysis. And so we really get to see discourse analysis in action and see how this interpretation method is used and what we can learn from it. At the beginning, he defines discourse analysis as in discourse analysis, we are concerned with what people using language are doing and with accounting for the linguistic features in the discourse as the means employed in what they are doing. And so what he's going to do is he'll go on after that definition and he'll talk about how discourse analysis focuses on the language in use. He says that a lot of interpretations focus on history and other things, but he says that discourse analysis really just looks at language and what's around the text. And so it's pretty interesting. He talks about that there's three central assumptions that we need to prepare for when studying discourse analysis. The first one that he talks about is that discourse analysis moves beyond the historical questions of what is behind the text to the text itself. And so, like I said, most interpretations look at the historical setting or what else is around the text, but this really just looks at the language and what we're looking at. Another assumption that he talks about is that interpreters account for a multiplicity of possible readings. And so when interpreting texts using linguistic features and other things, the truth is there might be some multiple meanings that people pull out. And so something that I like that he talks about is he talks about the difference between meaning and use. And so he says that more often in discourse analysis, people will use the word use of a text because they think that with that linguistic feature, the use of it is something instead of necessarily the meaning, which I thought was kind of interesting. Another assumption that he talks about is that discourse analysis finds discourse in its relation to power. In other words, what authority does the speaker have in relation to the audience? And so he talks a little bit about, what kind of thing we're reading. So if it's a letter or a narrative, and the relationship of the writer to the audience. So when Paul refers to Christians as his brothers and sisters, when writers use their authority as apostles, whatever the power of the person has, and shows their authority over the audience, that's something else that we need to remember when using discourse analysis. I really like that discourse analysis recognizes context and recognizes that statements rarely occur in isolation. And so statements are usually happening in the flow of a narrative or a conversation, and verses shouldn't just be taken as isolated and just studied alone, that they're part of a bigger story, they're part of a bigger paragraph, literally, that the writer has written that we should study and look at. And so discourse analysis, I think, does a pretty good job of recognizing that and not isolating texts. Another thing that Green says is that there is no language which is not embedded in the culture. When he talks about how language is affected by culture, and that we don't always know the culture, it's not always the same culture we know that we see that has affected the text. This really reminded me of the book Misreading Scripture with Western Eyes that we read in undergrad for Dr. Hatch's class, actually, that I remember reading that book and realizing, man, there's so many cultures outside of this American culture in Houston, Texas that I've grown up knowing that has affected how I read Scripture, and even language that is used as Scripture isn't always the same way I think that it should be used or is used. And so discourse analysis again reminds us that there is no language which is not embedded in the culture of that time. There's three central coordinates that Green kind of breaks down: cotext, intertext, and context. And so these all sound the same, so they were really confusing at first, but I think I got a hang of it. And so cotext is how a sentence is related to the linguistic data around it. And so in other words, how a sentence relates to the paragraph around it, the other paragraphs around it, and even the whole book. And so just looking at everything that the writer has written around what you're studying. The next thing is intertext, which refers to the larger linguistic frame of reference. And so not just what was written by that writer, but everything around it. And so at the writing of Luke, what other books are being written at the same time? The Septuagint that he was studying, Everything else that impacted how he wrote is what we would call intertext. And the last thing was context, which refers to the socio-historical realities around the text. One of the last things that Green talks about before he goes into Luke is a presupposition pool, which is a pool of knowledge one assumes to be possessed by one's audience, which the Bible actually seems to do a lot, where a writer will write something and not really explain it, kind of assuming that the audience knows exactly what he's talking about. And this happens a lot. And so in discourse analysis, we have to be aware of things that the writer seems that people will just assume that they know. And so that was pretty interesting, the presupposition pool. After that, Green jumps into Luke 3, and he starts using discourse analysis to interpret it so we can see it in practice. One of the things that I noticed that just kind of goes on throughout is that when interpreting it, he really focuses on context. So everything around the text, the co-text of it, the intertext, he just focuses on what Luke 3 is, how Luke 3 is relating to Luke and even the rest of the Bible. So I thought that was really cool. He actually starts off by saying Luke 3, 1 through 20 is a tightly woven into the fabric of Luke's narrative strategy. And so he starts off by saying, hey, Luke 3 is tightly woven into the whole strategy of all of Luke. It's not just an isolated chapter that we should read by itself. He even starts going into how Luke 3, 1 through 6 tie back to Luke 1. He talks about that they have similar geopolitical themes. He talks about the common motifs of forgiveness and other things, and even the same wilderness setting. And so all these things in Luke 3 remind Green of the language and other things focused on in Luke 1. And he actually talks about reading Luke 3 in a lens of Luke 1, which I thought was really interesting. Again, using the text to interpret the text, which is a pretty cool idea. He even talks about that the language used in Luke 3 is reminiscent of prophetic literature, which reminded me a lot of Richard Hayes' mention of echoes and how certain scripture will echo other scripture. And that's basically what Green does when using this discourse analysis of saying that a lot of the language sounds like a lot of things that the prophets said. I thought that was pretty interesting. And so in Luke 3, in the beginning, Luke starts listing out a lot of different rulers. And Green kind of shows how he uses the presupposition pool to explain this. And he says that the presupposition pool of the text, in other words, what the author assumed that the audience would know about this text is that they all automatically have a bad taste in their mouth about rulers, and that they recognize that the rich and the powerful usually don't have good views on them. And so he talks about how this affects the text. And when we read those rulers' names, we might not automatically think that, but he talks about how it would just be common knowledge to readers that Luke is listing these people who all kind of have bad reputations. I thought that was pretty interesting. Another thing that he points out, because in Luke 3, Luke will quote a passage from Isaiah to make a point, and I thought it was interesting that Green points out that this is not necessarily how Isaiah meant the text to be used, but instead Luke used it to be more persuasive. And so I thought that was pretty interesting because, again, looking at the language style of how Luke did it and recognizing the narrative strategy of the whole book, Green kind of looks at this quote and says, hey, that's not how Isaiah meant it. And so I thought that was kind of interesting. In page 238, Green says, in this way, the Isaianic vision of eschatological consolation has been recontextualized. I thought that was really interesting that it's been recontextualized. Focused on the events set in motion with John's appearance, with this interpretive pause complete, Luke can now return to the narration of John's activity among those who came out to participate in his ministry. And so I thought it was pretty interesting how he points out, by looking at the language and stuff, seeing how Isaiah's quote was recontextualized. And so those are just a few examples of things that Green does when interpreting Luke 3, using discourse analysis to show how the language and the language around the text and the chapters before the text and after the text and even in the Old Testament all affect how Green interpreted Luke 3. And so I thought that was really interesting. I really enjoyed this chapter on discourse analysis.